Should games let players skip levels? We've all come across a level or challenge that we just didn't want to do. Maybe it was so buggy it barely functioned. Maybe you had already played it at a friend's house. Or maybe it was just so tedious and frustrating that you wanted to stop playing. Whenever I look up a walkthrough for a level, I'm effectively asking to skip it. So wouldn't it make sense for the developer to add a system that allows players to skip content? Video games enforce that players don't skip, an idea that exists in no other art form. There's nothing stopping you from skipping to the end of a movie or novel, and yet the idea of doing it in a video game is unheard of. So today, we're going to take a deep dive into the world of skipping levels, and some of the people that are affected. Okay, but isn't skipping levels just lazy? Why would you possibly need to skip a level when you could just suck it up and push through it? Well, there are actually a lot of different scenarios where skipping content makes sense, and I'm pretty sure every single one of you can relate to at least one of these. First, even experienced developers make bad levels once in a while, and inexperienced ones make them all the time. Some of my favorite games have moments that I dread when I go back to replay them, and I'm usually not alone. Go on the subreddit for any game, and there's always that one area that everyone memes about. What's worse is that these levels are often time-consuming slogs, meaning that replaying your favorite game often includes a mandatory evening of frustration and boredom. Second, some players have intense phobias that prevent them from playing certain levels. For example, arachnophobia, the fear of spiders, is one of the most common phobias. Many people with this condition have a hard time playing levels that involve spiders, and this can keep them from playing certain games that they would otherwise enjoy. Games in the Souls series often have a spider-based boss, and this keeps certain people away from the series even though 95% of the game has no spiders. A lot of people don't realize just how debilitating certain intense phobias can be, and one unavoidable level can stop people from playing an entire game. Third, players with disabilities may be unable to complete a certain challenge, especially if it tests a skill set that isn't normally required. For example, if a player with a physical disability is playing a puzzle game, and one of the puzzles suddenly requires them to do something quickly, or press a button with precise timing, they may be unable to do that. If this is just a one-off instance, one unskippable level can make the entire experience unplayable. Fourth, some players have already played certain parts of the game, and don't want to replay sections. Let's say you started a game on the PS5, but after moving to a new city, you want to continue on PC. Should you be forced to replay dozens of hours of content just to get back to where you were? Or what if your save file gets corrupted? I had a friend that played over 20 hours of Final Fantasy XIII, only for a save file to be totally lost due to a technical issue, after which he never went back to the game. And last, what about people that do unusual things with games, like speedrunners and content creators? Speedrunners need to practice certain levels over and over in order to improve, and systems that allow them to skip around give them more freedom to practice at their own pace. And hey, what about me? I make videos analyzing games, and sometimes I just want to replay a small section of a game in order to better understand it or to collect footage. There are tons of reasons people might want to skip levels. They go far beyond just not wanting to get good, and not letting people skip around pushes a ton of people out of a gaming experience. However, I'm not blind to the very real downsides of letting players do whatever they want, whenever they want. Developers put up barriers because they make the experience better for the vast majority of players. While there are many legitimate reasons to skip, there are far more illegitimate ones. 9 times out of 10, players are better off resisting the temptation and playing the game the way the developer intended. If we make skipping too easily available, players will just ruin the experience for themselves, and take the easy way out when the going gets rough. There are 2 main problems here. First, players will be tempted to give up on a challenge without giving it their all. And second, players may miss critical lessons that skipped levels are designed to teach. Let's start with the first. I think there's something really beautiful about coming up against an insurmountable challenge and knowing you only have one way out. Through. Back against the wall, no other options, it's all up to you. I've never felt this more than the first time I played Dark Souls. I had a vicious case of pneumonia, and was the sickest I'd ever been in my entire life. Each day, I only had a few hours where I was coherent enough to play video games, and I wanted to play Dark Souls. I had played a little Demon Souls when I was younger, but this was my first time really getting into the series. I was barely able to function, and playing a game I was terrible at. But I knew deep down that my only option was to get better and beat the boss in front of me. I believed in myself, and the game believed in me. I wasn't constantly getting prompts like, maybe this one's too hard for you. If the game had given me the option to skip, I would have stopped believing in myself, even if I never actually skipped. My memory of that month would have been one of self-doubt and uncertainty, rather than one of self-belief and determination. Sometimes the choice is the problem. Even if you never say yes, the question itself has impacted your experience. Second, Skills that are taught in early levels are often critical later on. Sometimes the reason I'm struggling on a level isn't because it's too hard or poorly designed, but because I need to figure out a core game mechanic. Puzzle games rely on the fun of figuring out mechanics and interactions. Take a game like Baba Is You. The main appeal is figuring out all the crazy things that can happen as you maneuver the various words, objects, and characters. The game is fairly lenient, letting you try a variety of different levels, but certain ones are gated behind explicit requirements. This is usually because the blocked off levels rely on something you learned in a previous one. The game isn't denying you access to something you would actually be able to solve. It's keeping you away from challenges it knows you're not ready for. For example, levels 8 through 12 in the lake are a sequence of 4 subsequent challenges, each locked behind the previous. Level 8 introduces the concept of changing one object into another. This simple puzzle is designed to isolate the mechanic. The game knows that each entry requires a deeper understanding than the last, and so it keeps you from skipping ahead for your own good. In the real world, anyone's allowed to try making a flambéed baked Alaska, but if you're struggling with funfetti, you're unlikely to quell your frustration. So we clearly have 2 different problems that both need to be addressed. People in various circumstances need to be able to skip levels, but skipping shouldn't be an option that a majority of players even consider. And I think that with proper communication and presentation, these 2 needs can coexist. There are a ton of different implementations that could work, but I'm going to highlight 4 that I think are the most realistic. These are cheat codes, save data editing, walkthroughs, and alternate difficulty settings. Let's start with cheat codes, a staple of old school gaming that has unfortunately lost popularity over the years. Cheat codes have an interesting history. They started off as a debugging tool the developers added for testing, but once a few of them leaked to the public, they became a cultural phenomenon, getting passed around by word of mouth before the internet was a thing. Developers realized that cheat codes added mystery and intrigue to their games, and gave gaming magazines a reason to talk about them. However, over the years, both of these reasons became irrelevant. Developers got access to far more advanced debugging software, and adding cheat codes for testing purposes became an antiquated practice. The internet also meant that cheat codes were no longer mysterious and secretive. Everyone could now look them up at a moment's notice, and gaming publications could no longer stand out by talking about them. However, cheat codes were actually a great thing for the games that had them. They gave players additional options for how to play the game, without ever making it seem like it was the intended way to play. Cheat codes were obviously outside the understood rules of the game, and if you wanted the intended experience, you never really considered them. Cheat codes have been somewhat replaced by mods in the past couple decades. Using the God mode command in an old game is similar to installing a God mode mod. However, I don't think this is a suitable replacement. Mods require the player to install additional files, aren't vetted by the developer, and aren't an obvious solution to people's problems. If you can't get past a boss because you're scared of spiders, you're far more likely to give up than find a suitable mod to get past it. However, if there was a cheat code that allowed you to skip, most people would find the solution. Next, we have save data editing, giving players access to an editor that allows them to change their save file. This is similar to cheat codes in that it gives players more options, but is obviously not the intended way to play the game. The advantage of save data editing is that it gives players far more control over their file than a simple code. Let's say you want to skip to a certain section of an RPG. There are far more things that need to be addressed than just where your character spawns. How much experience did you gain? What items did you find? And what narrative choices did you make? Save data editing is already quite popular in the modding scene, but developers rarely do anything to make it easy to access. Adding in a built-in save data editor would give players the ability to mess with their save files without downloading external software. Of course, the downside of save data editing is that the barrier to entry is much higher than using a cheat code. No matter how simple you make it, there's always a learning curve for doing something under the hood, and people could seriously ruin their files if they don't know what they're doing. However, for complex games like RPGs, this may be the only way to go. Third, we have walkthroughs. This is technically not a form of skipping. If you use a walkthrough, you still have to play the level, and in the modern era, there's a walkthrough for every game with any commercial success. However, I would argue that for certain games, walkthroughs replace the need for skipping, and eliminate a lot of the problems that would come from a more robust system. Going back to Baba Is You, the main reason it blocks off levels is because you need to understand certain concepts before moving on. If you really can't figure out a level, skipping it would leave you lost and floundering, but following a walkthrough would teach you what you couldn't figure out and set you up to continue. Assuming there isn't anything horrifying and there's no dexterity requirements that would stop disabled players, a walkthrough is a perfectly serviceable option. Finally, let's talk about alternate difficulty settings. This may not seem like it has anything to do with skipping, but easier difficulty settings could allow for more options. About a decade ago, there was a debate about skipping all combat in games. The argument was that if players who don't care about the story can skip cutscenes, why can't players who only care about the story and role-playing skip gameplay? A number of people had a problem with this, and I think their underlying concern was that dangling the option to skip over players' heads would be both tempting and distracting to players who wanted a hardcore experience. However, this could all be addressed with dedicated difficulty settings that allow for skipping. If you wanted a challenging experience, you could play on normal or hard, but if you want to relax and jump around, story mode may as well allow for that. I think the game design world can have a narrow view on the way people play their games. Yes, some of the time, a person will pick up a game without ever having played it and play it from front to back, without any technical issues, life interruptions, or disabling conditions. But this is such an unreasonable box to lump everyone into, and the industry tends to just shrug, as if they always know the right way to play their game. I don't think that skipping levels solves every problem ever, but it gives players the tools to make the experience work for them, and as long as it's handled with a healthy dose of creative distance, there doesn't have to be any downside for the majority of players. Let me know in the comment section what games do a good job of giving players control over their experience. Thanks for watching.